Good morning, everybody. My name is Kai Unkrot. I'm a senior program manager, and I'm here to talk about planning and deploying a self-service BI environment using Microsoft BI technologies. But before we get started with that, how is everybody enjoying the conference so far? You having a good time? Well, that's about to end now. I'm planning to go very deep into the Power Pivot architecture. How many of you have used SharePoint already in your environment? Are you all SharePoint administrators and familiar with the technology? It seems like a lot of hands go up. That's good. Have you been exposed to SharePoint 2013 already, or are you on previous versions? Okay. This session is primarily about SharePoint 2013, how we integrate into the newest version of SharePoint, but most of the architecture is also relevant for 2010, and I will point out where the differences are so that you get the most out of the session. This one. But before we get started, while you're still in a good mood, let's get some logistics out. Please submit your session evaluations right now, before it is too late. You could win. Okay, session objectives. What do we want to do today? I would like to give you a brief overview of the Microsoft BI technologies for SharePoint. You might be familiar with it already. I'm not planning to spend too much time on it. And then we'll talk about the deployment tools and the deployment steps for the various technologies that you can bring into the SharePoint environment. We'll talk about the typical topologies and server configurations and typical issues that you might encounter and steps to resolve these issues and find the root causes. And we'll go, in that context, somewhat deep into the system architecture and how our components work. The managed self-service BI stack that we offer for SharePoint includes analysis services and reporting services from the SQL server side, as well as the SharePoint services such as Excel services, which is one of the most important services for BI in SharePoint 2013. Performance Point might be familiar to some of you as a BI technology. Maybe not so familiar, but Visio Services is also a BI-related technology that can consume data from a data model. And of course, on the user experience side, we have Office with its add-ins, GeoFlow and Data Explorer and Power Pivot and Power View, as well as the browser experience, which I didn't call out explicitly, which is a natural interface for SharePoint. And our deployment is pretty much focusing on these two boxes here at the bottom. We'll need a SharePoint environment, and we will need to deploy a BI backend for that SharePoint environment so that our technologies can work together. What do we bring to the plate as BI when you have a SharePoint environment with its typical capabilities, such as team sites and project sites and publishing sites? We offer browser interactivity for workbooks and reports. Workbook browser interactivity comes from Excel services, which is included directly in SharePoint. Therefore, I colored it a little bit yellowish. We also bring to the table workbooks as a data source. I will show you in a moment what that means. You can consume a Power Pivot workbook like an AS database, which can be a very neat feature for Office users, business users that want to build on top of solutions that other business users have built already. Schedule data refresh, a very favorite feature of Power Pivot, where you can go and configure a schedule for a workbook that you uploaded into SharePoint, and you can configure it on a scheduled basis for daily or weekly or monthly refresh cycles. So the system then will keep the data in that workbook automatically updated for you. We do not offer finer granularity as daily. And so this is one of the most popular features that our customers like to hack. And we acknowledge that. We made it easier to hack our scheduled data refresh in SharePoint 2013, and SharePoint 2010 it was a little bit more complicated. Why is this thing flipping all the time? So there we have some improvements for the passionate BI hacker. Then we have data alerts that come out of reporting services as well as Power View. And we have our Power Pivot gallery as a neat document library view. And for IT administrators, very important. We also have our management dashboard that lets the IT farm administrator keep an eye on what workbooks are in the farm, what users are using these workbooks, what are the characteristics of these workbooks, and how heavily is our backend utilized, what's the resources available on my backend servers to ensure that the quality of service is appropriate for BI. With that, let's start talking about planning our deployment. In SharePoint 2010, our deployment was relatively monolithic. It's not the right word, but it was an all-in deployment. You decided to deploy Power Pivot, and then it all came in one big package. There wasn't a light-up story for you. A little bit of a historic background on that. Power Pivot was first introduced with SQL Server 2008 R2. And at that time, we thought it was a really cool idea to bake the entire setup experience directly into SQL Setup. And we thought it was awesome. And we had this new farm wizard that would even configure the farm for you. But this idea didn't turn out to be so great because SharePoint is not this environment doesn't lend itself nicely to a synchronous setup experience. Many of the deployment processes in SharePoint are asynchronous. We come to that in a moment. And so when you run a setup tool, and not all your servers are available at the time you run the setup, then timeouts will occur, and setup will fail, and you cannot roll back. And so 2008 R2 was a great way to keep our support people busy. In fact, setup was one of the red zone areas where we had the most pain. We learned from that, and we began to make setup easier gradually. We were working on this. In SQL Server 2012, we introduced a separate config wizard. So SQL Setup would lay down the SQL bits. Then we have the config wizard with which you would deploy the farm components into your SharePoint environment, and that made things better. And now with 2013, we went one step further by moving some of the core Power Pivot features directly into Excel services. And that means at the first level, to establish a BI environment, you don't have to deploy any of the SQL Server technologies in SharePoint. All you have to do is configure Excel services and register a BI server, which is a separate server outside of the SharePoint environment, as your Power Pivot server that handles the data models. And that enables us to get into larger farm deployments where farm administrators are a little bit nervous about bringing the entire BI stack in. For example, at Microsoft, we have farms where we have 130,000 unique users. And those farm administrators at Microsoft IT that maintain these environments, they are not so fond of a scheduled data refresh for 130,000 users right there off the bat. They would rather take it easy and say, give me the minimum, and then we'll see later down the road whether we want to enrich that experience for the user in this SharePoint environment. One step that you need to perform in order to expose any BI capabilities is to install an analysis services server in SharePoint mode. That is, the name SharePoint mode comes out of the old 2008 R2 and SQL Server 2012 deployment into a SharePoint 2010 environment where all the components were in SharePoint. In SharePoint 2013, that AS server is outside of your farm, but it is still the same SharePoint deployment mode. If you're not familiar with deployment modes, AS supports 3 different deployment modes. One is for multidimensional databases, the traditional OLAP cubes. The second deployment mode is for tabular databases. And the third deployment mode is for Power Pivot. Why do we have separate deployment modes? That's a commonly asked question. It is because we do funny little things in each deployment mode different. Give you an example. The Power Pivot deployment mode has a performance optimization in it that violates the principles of transaction processing. In a transaction, you usually guarantee that when you complete the transaction, the changes are persisted, which requires you to flush the data on disk. Because if your server crashes after the transaction is complete, otherwise the database would be inconsistent. But we can violate that principle in Power Pivot because our master database is in a workbook. We always reload it. What you will also notice on a Power Pivot mode server, when you reboot that machine, we clear out the data folder completely. We wipe all the databases away. Excel services will have to reload these databases after a server restart. And that would not be such a desirable behavior if you run in tabular mode and you have your tabular databases up. You reboot the server, all your databases are gone. That would not be so nice. The third level is to install reporting services in SharePoint. Now you have a system that knows how to load a data model. You can query it. Excel services is already fully able to give you the experience for Power Pivot workbooks in the browser. You can click on slicers, interact with your data. And when you install reporting services, you also get to use Power View, both inside the Excel workbook as well as a standalone version. That's the major feature that reporting services in SharePoint 2013 adds to the table, as well as data alerts, of course. And then as the last level, we bring in the Power Pivot add-in. Those components that we were not able to fully put into Excel services in the Office 2013 timeframe, we put in a separate add-in that is available for download from the Microsoft Download Center. And that has our gallery in it, and it has scheduled data refresh in it, as well as accessing workbooks from outside the firm. I'll come to the architecture in a moment, that makes clear why I'm distinguishing between workbooks within and outside the firm. So let's go through a brief glance over a system that has all these components installed. If I can find the right button, that would be great. All right. I have various systems here installed. One is, for example, a SharePoint environment that has no capabilities deployed yet. This is just a standard SharePoint server. It doesn't even have Excel services. And if you upload a workbook to a system like that, naturally you will not be able to see a workbook. The system is still in the process of waking up. As you can see, I only have a minimum set of services enabled. How do you get Excel services deployed in SharePoint? The most simplistic way for me is to go to the configuration wizards. And there I can go through a list of all the services that are available, and that gives me the opportunity to talk about the services that we need in our farm. Excel services is only one. Let's start this wizard. I do not need access. I don't need the Ad Management Server or BDC. They might be useful, but I'm keeping them off my server so that they don't consume resources. I do need Excel services. I don't need translations or managed metadata. I don't necessarily need Performance Point in my self-service BI environment because Performance Point is really for BI pros more than for business users directly. If you disagree with me, then feel free to install it. I don't. We don't need PowerPoint or search. We do need the secure store service because we are storing credentials. For example, when you provide your users with the ability to configure a scheduled refresh, they have the ability to specify credentials within the schedule to say connect to this data source with the following user information. and that information is stored in secure store. So that's one reason we need it. Another is that all these services have the option, like Excel services, to access a data source with an unattended account, and an unattended account is also a set of credentials that you store in secure store. State service not necessary. None of these additional services are needed. And then we're good to go. Click next, and it's going to deploy a server that is now able to, it will take a little bit, that is now able to open an Excel workbook in the browser. That's a very interesting catch. Most folks go to, after a deployment, or I shouldn't say most, but I've seen it quite a few times. You deploy a really functioning environment, and you open, let's say, this workbook here. It's not, well, that's not really a great workbook. But you now say, yep, my system works. But it doesn't, because Excel services does not yet load the data model. It's a performance optimization from the perspective of Excel services. They give you the user interface as quickly as possible. They have the information cached in the workbook, so they really don't need to go to the data model just now and query that. That will only happen the first time you click on a slicer. So let me give you another one that actually has a slicer. Well, let me give you the current date. This is a workbook, a very simple one where I have one table with one row, the world's smallest Power Pivot workbook. It has the current date in it, and as you can see, this is not really my time right now. It is 8:46, not 8:41. But I could go here and test whether my model will be loaded, and I can say refresh my data, and when I want to refresh my data, now Power Pivot, meaning Excel services, really has to go load my model on my AES server, send the refresh command to the AES server, and then query the model and give me back the most recent data. Ta-da, time has changed, which proves also that my system is functioning. I don't really need to investigate too much with a little workbook like this whether every individual component works, because I have immediate feedback that it works. Of course, SharePoint is always a gift that keeps on giving. There are performance optimizations in here that can trick you too. If I go now and refresh this data one more time, you will not see that the data changes. What's wrong? Something broken in my system now? This is Excel services with its own denial of service protection kicking in, where they say, if you refresh very often, then we'll just give you the most recent that we think is good enough for you. I think the time interval is 10 minutes. So sometimes you might think your system isn't really working, but it actually does. So I already showed you the refresh capabilities, the browser interactivity. Let me show you workbooks as a data source. I worked in another presentation with my colleague and friend Diego Oppenheimer on some, Power Pivot deep dive, and one workbook that he created. By the way, this is the Power Pivot gallery that I'm showing you here right now. One workbook that he created is this Excel workbook to analyze tweets. And he had this little page in here where he could analyze and show you, oops, I clicked on the wrong button. What people were saying. This is just out of a SQL database. We imported the tweets there. And I was teasing him that I could recreate this user interface without the need for Excel, and I did that in PowerShell. And oops, this is my PowerShell. So if you are like me, passionate about the command line, you really don't need an Excel user interface in order to query that data model. I'm using a script here, and essentially, this is workbooks as a data source. I go in, I load the ADOMD.NET library, and I connect to this workbook as if it was my server. And then I can query this with standard MDX or DAX statements, get the results, and format these results nicely on my command line. So once you upload a workbook into SharePoint, into a BI-enabled farm, You really can use that like a normal AS database and build advanced solutions on top of it. Power View, for example, does that when you create a Power View report on a workbook. That's one of the nice features in a Power Pivot gallery. It makes it easy for you to create analysis on top of a workbook. Here we have this button to create Power View reports. Essentially, Power View does the same thing I just did with my script. It goes and references this workbook as the data source, and Excel services will go and load it for Power View, and then once the model is loaded, you can query it with Power View and you get your analysis that way. Yeah, that's about enough for a first introduction. Let's go back to our actual deployment. What farm topologies can you deploy with the SharePoint 2013 environment? Now that we moved our AS server outside of the farm, you actually can create small farms that share one server. This is this green square here in the bottom. I don't recommend it for anything other than very small demo environments, or if you have a team with 10 users. What we've seen with Power Pivot in many organizations is that individual business units or departments deploy their own SharePoint farms that they maintain internally themselves. And for them, it was not really cost efficient to deploy a full analysis server in every little farm that they had. And it makes sense for those smaller environments to share one server as long as the memory capacity on that server suffices. Keep in mind that Power Pivot is an all-in-memory technology, so every workbook that you load needs to fit into memory on that machine. And that can get tricky. Keep also in mind that a data model might be loaded multiple times. I'll give you an example. 2 users connect to the same workbook, and 1 user refreshes that workbook, like I just did with that date field. Now, the 1 user needs to see the old data, and the other user needs to see the new data. It wouldn't be right to just refresh the model also for the user who didn't refresh it. The way Excel Services does that, it sends a clone database command to the Power Pivot server, and Power Pivot will create a separate copy of that data model, and Excel Services will connect that new user that was refreshing now to this different data model. So there is, I would say, at least in an active farm, at least 2 to 3 copies of a data model on the server, and every one of them needs to fit into memory. It's fortunately easy to scale out. We'll come to that in a moment. But for the typical production environment, you would have a separate set of AS servers, maybe 2 for load balancing reasons. It's also fault tolerant because Excel Services detects dynamically whether the servers are available. We have a routine that checks the health of the servers and checks the memory pressure, checks the CPU load, and decides for every new model which server it should take. And if the server's offline, then it will take the other one and keep loading the databases. For very small demo environments like mine, sometimes I deploy all the components on one server, but I would not really recommend it because Excel Services is memory hungry. It takes almost 50% of the server right away. Then SQL Server, the relational database, is also memory hungry. They want to take all the memory. Then we come and we want to take 80% of the memory as well. And then we have some SharePoint shared services who also like reporting services in SharePoint mode who also would like to have a few bytes. It gets, on a VM especially, it gets very tight very quickly. Here we have the scale out. That's one of the things that our customers really like about SharePoint 2013. It is super easy for you to scale out an environment. When we come into the architecture, it becomes clearer why that is. In SharePoint 2013, Excel Services is the only component that knows anything about a backend server. Everybody else in this farm has to go to ECS, well, the acronym for Excel Calculation Services. If Excel Services is down in the farm, nobody gets to see anything BI. Reporting Services doesn't know anything about an AS server. Not even Power Pivot knows anything about an AS server anymore. In SharePoint 2010, that was different. In SharePoint 2010, the Power Pivot shared service maintained the AS instance that was running on the local machine. And so with the shared services infrastructure in SharePoint 2010, the Power Pivot services were able to see each other and were able to do load balancing. We don't do that anymore in SharePoint 2010. We still have the Power Pivot system service for specific purposes, like workbooks as a data source from outside the farm, which I will explain later. But for loading data models, everybody goes to Excel services all the time. It has some drawbacks. Excel services, but let's talk about the advantage first. The advantage is you install a new AS server in your backend, and all you have to do is register that server name in your Excel services configuration as an additional server in a simple list of server names. Job done. From that moment forward, all BI technologies in your farm will take advantage of that new server. That's really great. What's not so great is that now everybody has to go through Excel services, and Excel services does not support all workbook features. You can, for example, create cell comments that an Excel client supports very well, but Excel services does not support these features. And when you have that, then Excel services cannot save the workbook back to the content database. And that is one caveat when you configure scheduled data refresh. If you want to refresh a workbook that has unsupported features in it, it doesn't work. The refresh will fail, and it will tell you specifically this workbook has unsupported features. Please remove these features or don't refresh your workbook. One embarrassing issue is that Power View right now is not a supported Excel services feature. So the moment you add a Power View report to a workbook, you cannot configure scheduled data refresh anymore. We are working on this, but that was really something. Oh, one last thing that I would like to mention on the slide is when you deploy an AS server, let's deploy an AS server. Why don't we do this in practice? All right. When you deploy an AS server, you must specify the Excel services service account as a server admin. So let's deploy one. Here on this blank machine, you run SQL setup. And this is just a Windows 2012 server. There's nothing else on it. There are no SharePoint bits on this machine. You don't need that. SQL setup starts. You go to the installation. You say, yep, I want a new server, standalone. Another point worth pointing out is that this Power Pivot mode does not support failover clustering because it doesn't make sense for us to do failover clustering with these servers, as Excel services is already doing the failover. Now I need to restart my computer because that's too bad. I can't go through here right now. I'll come back to that later after I restarted this machine. Sometimes our IT department updates our machines, and then we get patches, and then we need to restart. Fortunately, I have a few environments here, so let's go to another one. Here I already have analysis services installed on this machine. On this one here, I'm connecting to this machine. I'll explain to you in a moment why I had to go to this one for my management interface. But when I display the server properties, you get this little security tab. And you see that I've configured the demo environment with various services accounts, and I granted all these services accounts admin rights at the server level. This is required for Power Pivot and Power Pivot deployment modes only, because the security in Power Pivot mode works differently to the other two deployment modes, which is also a reason why we have those as separate modes. In a Power Pivot workbook, we say there is no security. Somebody that has access to the workbook has access to the data model and all the data. Security is applied within SharePoint at the workbook level. You specify the permissions of a user, like view only, then they can only work with this workbook in the browser or edit the workbook. The moment you grant somebody at least view only permissions, he has full access to view the data model. The reason that is because the user actually never accesses the data model. It's the SharePoint services that interact on behalf of the user with analysis services, and so that they can carry out their tasks in Power Pivot mode, they need to have the right as a server admin. It's a security thing where we say, you must be a server admin, only then do we allow you to act on behalf of the user in this particular mode. That was one of the ways we got around Kerberos constraint delegation within a SharePoint environment, at least between SharePoint and the AS server. Let's see if my other machine has already restarted. Otherwise, we'll come back to that. OK. So you deploy this, run SQL Server. Make sure that you configure all the services accounts that are relevant on this machine as server admins, and you're good to go. All you then have to do is configure Excel services. So let's do that now. As I said, this should be relatively easy and uneventful. On this test environment that I have here, all I have to do is go to Central Admin. And in Central Administration, all I'm going to do is go to the Excel Services Service application, into the properties of the service application, and then they have their section for BI servers, and I pencil in my little server name, and life is good. At least in theory, life is good. But there are plenty of opportunities to forget something. The first thing, you might deploy a SQL Server 2012 server and think you're good. You're not good. You need a SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1 server. The reason for that is we modified the image load command so that Excel services can stream the data model to the server wherever that server is located. In the old architecture in 2012, we download the workbook from the content database to the local server, which is always local on the Power Pivot machine, put it there and send an image load command with a file path. And then we load it from the file system. This is different now. We send with the image load the data directly over the wire to the server, which is really cool for us. Then we can deploy AS anywhere. But the drawback for you guys is if you bring in a server that is not Service Pack 1, then the streaming doesn't work because that old server just doesn't know how to do that. Another opportunity for error is you just happen to forget to add the service accounts as server admins. Let me complete this step, then I'll show you a little troubleshooting help. So here down there in the Excel Services application, you see the data model settings. And there you see I have a server already registered, and if you have a second server, you just click on Add Server. You type in the server name, and you're good to go. Another interesting catch here is if you're working a lot with SQL Server, you might be used to the shortcuts like a period for or localhost. I recommend you do not use those here because that period would mean a different thing on every Excel services server that you may have in your SharePoint farm. Right? It always refers to a local instance, which may not even be on that machine. Make sure you always specify the fully qualified server name, or at least the NetBIOS name, and don't forget the instance name. It's also a common, tip point that where folks just enter the server name and think they have the instance. No, a Power Pivot instance in this version is always called something /Power Pivot. And that needs to be specified. So let me show you, if you have trouble with this step to get ECS to load a data model, go to our team site. It's blocks.msdn.com/PowerPivot. It'll bring you into the Analysis Services team block. And down here somewhere in this list, we have an article that explains to you exactly what you might want to look for in the usage and ULS logs within SharePoint. And what you need you need to find these 5 entries that will tell you things are okay or not. I don't think that is a good resolution for us here. Let's zoom. There. It checks whether I have a valid server configuration, the right version on that server. It checks that I have my administrator. It checks that the deployment mode is right. Also, one catch, sometimes folks deploy a Tableau instance and register that one there. That doesn't work because that's the wrong deployment mode. And it also checks whether the server in itself has the right data provider. I'll come to that in a moment. And when you have all these, when they say all pass, then you're good to go. This one is an interesting one for us. This is a build number. This is the build number of SQL Server 2012 Service Pack 1 CTP3. That was a beta version when we first introduced this feature. The official version has a 3000 here at this. The official Service Pack 1 version has a 3000 in this spot. So any number that is larger than 3000, you're good on the build number of your, on the server version of your AS backend server. Could you use the mic, please? So the question was what URL our team blog is. It is blogs.msdn.com/powerpivot. Okay, let's move on. Let's go deeper into our architecture and talk a little bit about how things really work so that the entire deployment experience becomes a bit more pleasant when you encounter issues when things don't go so smoothly. Workbooks as a data source works always with Excel calculation service, always. Whenever anybody accesses a workbook, Excel calculation services will generate a name. Imagine you have an AS server here. This is my AS server. That guy is blank. Nobody has a data model there. Are you all familiar with how PowerPivot stores the data model in a workbook? You know this? Well, let me show you. So we have a workbook here on the desktop. Yep. So let me rename this workbook for you. I need my glasses. Okay. Renamed. Now I'm inside the workbook, its structure. I go here. Oh, sorry. I guess I'm not in the workbook for you guys. Okay. What did I do so far? I renamed this workbook from XLSX into zip. And then I opened that zip file, and here we are. And in here, I should have my model. And there's my data, 60 megs worth of data. That is the data model as it sits in Excel in this workbook. And you upload this together with your workbook into the SharePoint farm. And then when you want to access and interact with that model, with this little item.data thing, by the way, this is an ABF file. This is a backup file of an AS database. No magic there. Excel calculation services will go to the content database, get the workbook, as it always has to render it in the browser. And at that time, it also has the data model. It'll stick that item.data into this image load request and sends it to our AS server. This SSPM stands for Streaming Server Pool Module. Our developers created that. We had quite some discussions about that name. Great. So once you have that model loaded, only Excel calculation services at that time knows what the name is. Let me show you what the name of an AS server is. Remind me to switch this over. So we go back here to that server. Here are my databases. I have already two loaded because we did something. As you can see, I worked with this Excel workbook. So what do these names stand for? That's 2013 specific. In 2012, we generated different names. SSPM stands for the Streaming Server Pool Module, as I already explained. So we know, this comes from Excel services. If we go from the back, the next GUID is a random GUID that ECS just generates on the fly to make sure that we don't have a naming conflict with any other data model on the server. The next GUID is the instance GUID of the ECS service itself, so that this service instance can query for all the data models it loaded itself. That is, for example, important when we have an AS server that we share between two different farms, so that this one instance doesn't maintain or delete models that come from another instance. And then we have a database naming limit of 100 characters, so we stick as much of the workbook name in the front as fits there within our character limitations. And that is our database model name in AS. And as I said, this is something that ECS generates on the fly with random GUIDs. Nobody can figure that out other than ECS at the time you actually request the load. And then, in addition to that, ECS might clone the model and might throw away the old model. It does a lot of things within the ECS space that it makes sense for ECS that nobody else really cares about. But ultimately, nobody else knows what the name of that model is, and you also don't know on what server that was loaded. So you have to, if Performance Point or reporting services or our own Power Pivot system services, if we want to access a data model, the first thing we have to do is we have to go to ECS through the ECS APIs and SharePoint and ask ECS, hey, I have a workbook path here that's a URL. Can you please give me the name of the data model? And in case you haven't loaded it, would you please load it for me and tell me then what the name of the server is and the data model? And then once we have that, we connect directly to this data model through TCP/IP. That is also a difference to SharePoint 2010. In SharePoint 2010, our stack communicates over WCF, which is an HTTP-based protocol within a SharePoint farm. Here we go straight with TCP/IP. That has performance advantages for us. The protocol doesn't get more efficient than sitting straight on TCP/IP we use DIME on top of it and then XMLA. And this logic is hidden behind our data providers. And that means also that you need to have the latest and hottest data provider in your farm, because the older data providers from SQL Server 2012 didn't really know that there was an Excel services instance that they had to ask for something in this kind of an environment. But other than that, the flow is very straightforward. If you make sure that you have the latest data providers installed on all your servers, I come to the methods to get this deployed in a moment. Then it really goes to browser, goes through Excel Web Access as usual, goes to ECS, wants to access a workbook. You have clicked on a slicer, so ECS knows it needs to query data. It loads the model or already has it loaded. Then it knows it's in its cache, connects, queries, returns the results. An Excel client can actually connect to a published model and consume the data model directly as in a linked workbook, like when you connect to an AS server. In that case, they go through our Power Pivot web service, which goes to the system service, which talks to ECS real quick and then connects directly and queries, and everybody is happy. You can do this same with remote farms. Let's say you publish a workbook that connects to a different workbook in another farm that goes also to the Power Pivot web service. And then we have all the others, such as the PowerView client. It's a Silverlight client that runs on your local machine that connects to the reporting services front-end add-in, that talks to the reporting services service application, that uses ADO-MD.NET, that talks to ECS, gets the model loaded, connects, and then comes back with the responses. I'm always amazed how fast these interactions really happen on a system. It doesn't occur to you when you interact with a model, either in PowerView or in a browser, directly in a workbook, how many wheels and turn there within a farm in this moment. Okay. Now, let's talk more about the deployment. I hope my server is back up. As I mentioned, here we are. You just run SQL setup. But there is another kink that I would like to point out, and that is, again, something that comes out of our history with SQL Server 2008 R2. And that is, we have this completely separate setup mode for SharePoint. That comes out of this historic thing where we wanted to deploy everything in one step. So we kind of had a complete separate path. And that now makes it a bit of an awkward setup experience. If you want to deploy reporting services, you need to go a completely different setup path than when you deploy AS. And sometimes you want to have AS and reporting services and SharePoint all on the same machine, and you go, gee, why do I have to run SQL setup twice? But you have to in this moment. There's another thing, and that is related to the relational engine in that case. Sometimes you want the relational engine, sometimes you don't. But I'll come to that in a moment when this check is done. But we bind the SQL Server management tools to the relational engine. So sometimes you just, if you want to make it like me in a demo environment easy for yourself, you just deploy the relational engine on the machine, even though you don't need it. But you get the management tools in one step. Otherwise, you have to run AS setup once, and then again, you run setup just to install the management tools. Give you a server that doesn't have the management tools here in my demo environment. This guy doesn't have SQL Server Management Studio. It runs an AS server because I chose not to deploy the SQL engine here on this machine. And so I need to go to my other SQL machine and manage that server through SSMS here on that box. Not dramatic, but if you only have one server, then it can get frustrating sometimes. So when we go through here, yep, we're evaluating. Yes, give me that too. Please. What else could I show you in the meantime? Well, this is checking things. Not really. Okay, while this is still checking, let's go back to our fantastic team blog. I have another article that I would like to point out, and that is about how you can verify that you have the right data providers in your farm environment. I've already showed you a sample where I connected to a workbook within a PowerShell script, and you can use the same mechanisms to verify that your configuration in SharePoint actually works. There's this article verifying the configuration. All you do is you go with a bunch of scripts. You have a bit of an architecture diagram again. Like you check, hey, do I have actually a BI server in my ECS configuration? Is the correct provider version installed? It's the same version number, basically. 2809 was our beta version again, and now it's 3000. If that comes out as 3000, life is good. Can you connect to that model? Maybe there's an error, maybe that you can connect, and life is okay. And so here I'm showing an error to show something how to troubleshoot. But there are a bunch of scripts in here that you just can run real quick to make sure your environment is really working properly. And the nice thing at the command line, you get meaningful error messages back, which is not always the case in SharePoint, right? Because SharePoint has this notion that they don't want to give clear error messages to potential attackers. So you always have to go back to the USS log. I think it's more convenient to go and just run a few scripts. All right, we're good. Let's continue our setup. Now we're reaching the page where we have to make that critical decision. This is the normal SQL feature installation that you would go down to install a database, and this is our SharePoint installation. And here, this checkbox doesn't just say, give me a relational engine, it also says, give me the management tools or don't give me the management tools. So if I keep that deselected here, it'll give me a feature selection page that only has the engine but no management tools, and there's nothing you can change about that. If I go back here and select this checkbox, then you'll get the management tools as well. And folks really often ask us, why did you make it that way? Why can't I change things now? And as I said, this is a historical thing. We're gradually improving our setup experience, but we are not at the end of the road yet. And then you get through the setup. It's really uneventful for the most part. You can specify your custom folders for the data directory. That is sometimes an important step when you have a larger drive somewhere on your system. And as part of setup, you can also specify the server administrators. You don't have to do this in SSMS. I already showed you this server properties list where you can do it at any time, but it's also possible to do it right in the setup experience. I'm not going to run through all this. The service account is also an interesting notion. You can now use a normal anti-authority account like a network service. You don't have to use a domain account for this AS server anymore. And here's this page where you can add your server administrators like you can add yourself as a current user, and then you go through the rest of these steps. Here's the tab, for example, for the data directories if you want to customize them. And then you just finish this setup, and then life is good. Don't forget to register it in ECS, of course, in Access Services. continue with our presentation. As I already pointed out, you have to have the data providers on every machine in your farm environment. Now, how do you get the data providers onto this? There's a detail that I need to point out to you, and this is this ECS API. We have a component in our data providers that we call SP client. That is a component that you need for these data providers to talk to the ECS API. And that component ships only in one MSI other than in SQL setup. And that is our SP PowerPivot.msi. That is our PowerPivot add-in that you can download separately from the internet, from the Microsoft Download Center. Right? Imagine you have a farm, a number of servers, let's say 4, and you have your AS servers completely outside of that farm, then you do not want to run SQL setup on these boxes. So how do you get the latest data providers? You download this MSI, and you run it, and you can deselect PowerPivot for SharePoint. That component is not needed on all the SharePoint servers. This component installs our configuration wizard and all the solution packages that we have to actually deploy us in a farm. But the other 3 components you could or should install. Make it consistent. You could figure out which service uses which data provider. For example, Excel Services uses MS OLAP, our OLEDB provider. PowerView uses ADOMD.NET. And maybe some component uses AMO, our management objects, and maybe not. And there, in 2008 or 2, we explained to customers, this service uses this, and that service uses that. You don't have to deploy it here. You don't have to deploy it there. Don't do that. Just put these data providers on every server that you have in the farm, have one consistent configuration, and you can rest assured that things work. So on every SharePoint server that you have, deselect this PowerPivot for SharePoint component, or even install that too. It doesn't harm you. It just puts some bits on the file system, and just run through it. The SP client component is invisible here, and we don't make you give you the option to select that one, but it will be installed with every component that you pick there. If you download any of the other data provider packages that we have, you can install MS OLAP, for example, separately. Then you're out of luck because the SP client component is missing and you cannot communicate with ECS, and workbooks as a data source will not work. It's not dramatic. We do reference counting. If you have the data providers already installed, just download this MSI as well and install it, and life is good again. Yeah, so there we are. This is how you get the BI environment ready for our features. You get this MSI and you run it on every one of your servers to make sure that you have the latest version of our data providers with the required components for the SharePoint environment. And then you're good. On one server, if you want to deploy the add-in, on one server, you should also deploy this PowerPivot for SharePoint component. What this does, it creates a folder on the file system under program files where we put our config wizard and our solution deployment files. Just by installing this, you do not get PowerPivot yet into SharePoint. You get the tools to deploy PowerPivot into SharePoint, but that is a separate step. We already demoed that. So let's talk a little bit about deploying that PowerPivot add-in as a separate step inside the SharePoint environment. You downloaded this MSI. If you want to see it in practice here on this machine, let me cancel out of this one here real quick. Here I have my SP PowerPivot MSI. Again, sorry. Here's my MSI on my little installation media. I downloaded it. You click Next, accept the licensing agreement, and there are your components, and you can say, nah, I don't want this component, for example. Don't install that. But go through with the rest of the data providers. Easy, quick. You can also do this from the command line, like with any MSI. So once you have deployed, however, this component that sorry for flipping the screens. Once you have deployed this component on a SharePoint server, you get the configuration tool. Let me show you this on my SharePoint server here. You get this configuration tool, and there is now another important aspect that you need to pay attention to. and that is our config tool is called, where do I have it here? There. It's called Power Pivot for SharePoint 2013 configuration. We also have a config tool for Power Pivot for SharePoint 2010. When you install SQL Server directly on a SharePoint server, you get both configuration tools. If you run the wrong version, it's no harm. It'll detect that it is the wrong SharePoint version, and it will tell you to run the other config tool. It's, however, unfortunate that we didn't have just one config tool for both versions. We had some differences in the configuration aspects. For example, in 2013, our tool can also configure BI servers for Excel services directly in the UI. And so that was one thing that the 2010 config tool couldn't do, and so we thought it was easier to provide two separate tools for that. So for me to run this config tool now, I need to kind of hack my SharePoint environment a little bit. Don't do this in real production environments, please. I basically need to pretend that there is no SharePoint installed on this machine. So I need to go into the registry and basically deregister my SharePoint. I hope I can find that path real quick. Need my glasses here. Where is shared components? Does anybody see them? Shared. Do you see it? There's Office Server, but yeah, but that's, I need the secure key for the farm where the master, I think it's shared tools. And then, yes, and then web server extensions, exactly. Thank you for helping. Yep, and then it is this guy that I need. Let's rename that one. And then one more step while we're at it. I need to rename my central administration site because the config tool checks for that too. And then I can run my config tool again, and it will think that I don't have a SharePoint server here. Sorry, I'm giving a bad example. You should never do this with a SharePoint server. But what do we do for our config tool? So now we're good. Let's start this baby up. There you go. It'll go into the deployment mode. And then we can talk a little bit about what this config tool is. This config tool actually is a fantastic tool that we developed. We had an awesome idea. We said, how do we get out of trouble with deployments? Best way to do it is you do nothing. And that's what this config tool does. It does nothing. It actually just executes PowerShell scripts in the back, depending on the information that you provided. And the sweet thing for these PowerShell scripts is that you can use them directly. If you want to automate, where's my tool? There it comes. If you want to automate a deployment, you don't have to go through this tool. What you see here is the mode when it doesn't detect the SharePoint farm on this machine. It'll give you even the option to configure the farm completely, like it was in the old days. You just specify a farm account and a name, and then the content DB server, and then you're good to go, and it'll go through the entire list and configure all the components for you. If you want to know how these components are configured, just select one and then go to the script tab. And it will tell you the exact command that we're executing in the background to get this component configured. So this is a tool that not only deploys you a Power Pivot configuration in SharePoint, the add-in, it is also a tool that you can use to look at the scripts and copy out of these scripts what's useful for you and customize your deployment if you have a large deployment that you want to perform unattended. What does our add-in add eventually as part of its deployment with this config tool? We will add WSM link file support, which is a little connection file that you can use to register your data sources inside SharePoint, and then users can use the URL to the WSM file instead of the server name and database name. It might be more convenient for some users to use a WSM link file that way. We have our Power Pivot web service, which provides access to workbooks as a data source from outside the farm. This is why workbooks from outside the farm does not work if you don't have the add-in installed. But workbooks as a data source work still within the farm because our data providers know how to talk to ECS directly. They don't need, inside the farm, they don't need the help of this service. Our management dashboard is a feature that allows you to track what workbooks you have in your farm environment and who is using them. Our Power Pivot UI, that's our gallery. You've already seen that one. And data feed export. That's a button on a normal SharePoint list that you can use to import the list content as a data feed into a Power Pivot workbook. And then we have our timer services. Most importantly, for schedule data refresh, we have a timer service that kicks on frequently into our Power Pivot system service, which we add. Basically, every minute, this timer service says, system service, check your refresh tables, look if a workbook needs to be refreshed. And we have some usage statistics collectors that we need to update our management dashboard source workbook. And also, as part of the deployment, we create a service AppDB in the backend. Yep, we already showed that. These are the files that you can find on the file system. This is a dummy solution file for 14 mode because SharePoint 2013 supports both 14 and 15 mode. And in order to use a site within the 14 mode that looks at specific GUIDs, it's actually a relatively empty file that we just need to register these GUIDs for 14 mode. The real solutions are the farm solution, which has our system service primarily in it, and the web application solution, which has our UI and the gallery and the schedule refresh pages and all these things. And very important is that this web application solution is, as the name implies, scoped at the web application level. So when you deploy Power Pivot in a SharePoint environment, and you create later a new web application and a site collection with it, you will find that the Power Pivot components do not work because this solution is not automatically deployed in SharePoint to every new web application. You need to go into central administration. Let me bring back my farm so that we can show that. I hope the server forgives me for doing what I just did. And back to the registry. There you go. I think we're good. Central administration. Oh, well, it's waking up right now. So before we continue with that, to show you the solution files, how they are deployed, here's a little overview how you can script things. When you look at the scripts that we have in our config tool, we load some PowerShell add-in that makes it easier for us to have certain commands a little more concise. And in order to get this, you need to deploy this Power Pivot farm solution manually. And then when you have done that, it's one single step for your farm, then you have this available. You can load our solution, and then you can actually script the same way that the Power Pivot config tool scripts on that. A little excursion again to our demo environment and to the blog. If you have problems with solution deployments, I have another blog article for that one. Sometimes you will find that these solutions don't deploy successfully inside SharePoint, and you can produce that very quickly. All you have to do is shut down a SharePoint server, because SharePoint uses the timer service to deploy solutions, and if your server is not running, then you will not get your solution deployed. And as long as the solution doesn't get fully deployed, the deployment cannot succeed completely. And so you have a kind of inconsistent farm, and that is not really nice here. To get all the screenshots, I just shut down one of my servers, timer services on one of my boxes, and then I show you a few of the commands that you can use, like here to look at the status of a package, like the Power Pivot farm WSP. So you have here another set of command lines as tools to, if you encounter problems with solution deployments that are SharePoint related, that you get more information than what the user interface provides you. If you make sure that all your servers are up and they can all communicate with each other, you shouldn't encounter these kinds of problems. But they do frequently occur. So let's go into our solution deployments. They are in Central Admin under System Settings. And here under Manage Farm Solutions, if you have created a new, oops, where am I now? Wrong spot, not Farm Features, Farm Solutions. When you have created a new web application, make sure that you go to this solution package here and deploy it. I don't have another web application right now. You get a deploy link, you click on it, and you make sure that you deploy it to the new web application. This will basically inject our binaries into the virtual folder structure of this new web application, and then our UI, for example, the gallery, finds its assembly and can show you the user interface. Okay. What else is there? Here I'm talking again a bit about the purpose of each individual solution file. We have 3 in SharePoint 2013. In SharePoint 2010, we only had 2. In case you wonder why this 14 thing is flying around there now with us here on this 14 solution level. Yep, and that's basically the steps that you have to perform to get the fully functioning SharePoint environment. You deploy these once, you install our Power Pivot features with the config tool, and then you have to activate the Power Pivot features at the site collection level. That's the next step that I also would like to show you. Once a site collection has our solutions deployed, you can enable their features. And let me go back to my normal site here. In order to deploy the features, you go to Site Settings as the Site Collection Administrator, and then you need to go into Site Collection Features. And you need to make sure, specifically the SharePoint Site Collection Administrator needs to make sure that our Power Pivot solutions are enabled. Here. If they are active, life is good. If they are deactivated, like when you have a new site collection, this is a manual step that needs to be performed, then you will find that our solutions are not available. People might wonder why they can't create a Power Pivot gallery, for example. That could be one of the reasons. Okay. Yep, we've done that. Patching a server is also a lot easier than in SharePoint 2013. In 2010, you had to worry about the state of each AS server in the farm and so forth. You don't have to do this anymore because the AS server is now separate. You install the patches on all the machines. Like, let's say we have a new MSI with data providers. You just go around and install them, and then life is good again. Let's talk a little bit more about the data refresh feature that I already showed you. There are nuances in there that have to do with authentication. And authentication can sometimes be a little tricky. Let me try to explain this on this demo environment. I've showed you already my funny workbook that had the time. When I click on refresh like I did before, hold on, I think it's under Documents. Here. When I click on data refresh here, I actually perform the data refresh as an interactive user. And interactive users always have a bit of a challenge with authentication because the interactive user identity needs to be conveyed to the backend. And that might require special configurations that you may or may not want to enable. What happens when you do a data refresh like that is Excel Services goes to the Claims to Windows token service, because in SharePoint you're a claims user, and gets the Windows identity of your user account. That already only works for Windows users. If you come into a farm with SAML sign-in or with forms-based authentication, that does not work. Then when you have that Windows identity, it'll send us the username as part of the processing command to analysis services. And analysis services will go again with Kerberos protocol extensions to the domain controller and say, for that user, please give me the identity. And that only works if that analysis services service account has the right to act as part of the operating system. If you're not familiar with this right, act as part of the operating system basically says, this service account can do on my machine anything it wants. It's a part of the operating system. It is almost equivalent to the local system account. In fact, one of the ways to troubleshoot this is to run, instead of a network service, like I showed you how I configured AS, just change that service account, specify local system, see if interactive refresh all of a sudden works, and you know that you have a permissions issue on that machine. Either you grant the service account that AS uses this act as part of the operating system right, or you just decide to run it as local system, if you want to enable that scenario. There's nothing we can do about this. This is Windows security. It's a requirement on their side, so that you can actually act on behalf of a user just like you want. And then when it's a processing that goes to another database, that is yet another hop, then you need Kerberos constraint delegation between these two as well. Otherwise, this AS server now cannot act on behalf of that user to the data source. That's a bit of a complex thing. And as I said, it only works for Windows users. If you don't have Windows users, or if you don't want to enable this special permission, then you need to go into your workbooks. Let me go here into a workbook and change the authentication settings within that workbook. Let me just rename this one real quick again. It's very hidden. It's under connections, properties, and then somewhere there, Excel has this Excel authentication settings, and they are not very intuitive. If you specify, I'm coming to this dialog box in a moment, as soon as my client gets there. So here are a lot of workbook connections. My data model is here. No, it's not. Where am I? No, that's, I can't even find it myself right now. No, it's in the Excel data connections tab somewhere here. It's very embarrassing for me that I can't find it right now. It's not really here. Anyway, I think it is under here. If I hadn't so many connections, let me go here, properties. Yep, and now we're in business here on that one, for example. And you can then, on this button here, get to the Excel services authentication settings. As you've seen, there's already a lot of dialog boxes that you need to walk down as a user. And then you get these cryptic selections. None, for example, means Excel services will use its unattended service account. Right? Remember I talked about the secure store service real briefly. You can use a secure store target application ID that you register in the Excel services configuration as the unattended account. And if the user specifies none here, then Excel services will go with that unattended account. And that doesn't have these local system requirements because the unattended account, we have the username and the password. And with the username and password, you can do a regular logon, and that doesn't require these Kerberos extensions. But you still have the requirement of KCD between the AS server and your SQL box or your other data sources if they use Windows authentication, because that second hop, you still need to delegate identities. Or the user can specify a stored account directly if that user knows a secure store ID that the user account has access to, and he can specify that name here. And then this workbook will work with the stored credentials to refresh the data. This complex issue only applies to the interactive data refresh scenario, not to the scheduled data refresh. And then this is basically what I already explained, the timer service kicking into the system service, and that's performing the refresh with the help of Excel services. And then I'm running a little out of time. We have the management dashboard, which is an infrastructure where all our components are instrumented in a way that we write into the usage logs of SharePoint. And SharePoint has this usage processing timer job that we extend with our own components, and then we extract from the usage logs directly into our service AppDB, into a table, the information that we are interested in. And this gray path is just for backward compatibility. It's not really used in 2013. And then we have our management dashboard processing timer job that in frequent intervals updates the management source workbook. And then you get to see the management dashboard inside central administration. Let me show that real quick. And then we're done. By the way, there is also a capability in the management dashboard to customize this. I have the URL here at the bottom. The deck will be available for download. If you're interested, for example, to combine usage statistics from multiple farms, one way to accomplish this is just, as I explained with workbooks as a data source, you connect to this management source data workbook, like an AS database, and you can have multiple connections, and you combine this data in another workbook, and then you can have an analysis over your entire infrastructure, no matter how many farms you have there. So let me show you what the management dashboard by default provides. And of course, with a custom solution that connects to the source workbook, you can also provide more information, mash it up with additional information you might have in other data sources. It's a Power Pivot experience like any other. All right. It's coming up every minute. By the way, these are small VMs that I have in Windows Azure. So here's, for example, my server health chart. I can look here and see, okay, how is my CPU doing on my backend system? Yeah, that one is at 12%. That's not so bad. How's the memory doing? Yep, it's going up and down here on my server a little bit. I can see what kind of test workbooks I have on this machine and how many queries they have and how large they are. And I can also see the activities as well as the users that are using them here, like the user count on this one is 16. That can help an IT department to, for example, to identify which workbooks are really important, which ones are the ones that our users are using. Another important and useful piece of information that we have in our management dashboard is the data refresh history. I don't have any scheduled data refreshes here, but as you can see, we will give the farm administrator, for example, a list of all the errors that occur in a data refresh. It can happen in normal operations that refreshes fail. Imagine you have a user importing data from Oracle, and you just don't happen to have the Oracle data provider on your AS server, then a refresh of that data connection will naturally fail because the AS server cannot connect to that Oracle server unless it has the data provider installed. And then you would see the data refresh errors here, and you can then make a decision whether you want to take action or you want to declare that this workbook cannot be refreshed in the farm. And then I'm pretty much through my presentation. I hope it gave you enough information to succeed with the deployments of SharePoint, at least at a high overview level with some selective deep dives. We have a number of troubleshooting tools that may be helpful. The number one, of course, is you go and check the ULS logs. A ULS viewer could be a good pausing tool for that. You just connect with ULS viewer and it gives you all the transactions. Fiddler is a very useful feature if you want to troubleshoot communications within a SharePoint farm, for example, if you want to see how these services interact with each other. You could also do it on a more detailed level with Network Monitor, for example, if you really want to see what's going on between an AS server and the SharePoint server. You could also use the SQL profiler, for example, on AS to see all the queries that are coming in. And Performance Monitor could be useful if you really have resource issues on your backend servers. Then we have the management dashboard and the source workbook if you want to build additional service for yourself, and SQL profiler on the SQL side, already mentioned. And then we have our team blog, and we have a very good active MVP community. Lots of people are blogging about our technology. You should be able to find to any issue some helpful tips and tricks. So, because I'm already over time, let's make this short. There are a few more BI tracks today. And yeah, this is just a blank slide. And the sessions will be available also for download for the attendees later. Thank you very much.